Hi everyone, it is week 12, and here's what that means. That means that we have week 12 and week 13, both of which are before Thanksgiving, and except for your term project, which is a pretty big deal, we're going to be done in the next 2 weeks with assigned readings. And so I call this lecture Where We Are Going Part 1, because where we are going Part 2 is going to be week 13. So let me get right into that, and I will explain where we're going with the readings for the next couple of weeks. Okay, so let me situate this administratively, if I will. Where we're going, parts 1 and 2. So the way I've designed this is that weeks 12 and 13 are designed to work together. I had originally planned a week 12 journal, that would be this week, but I've changed that to week 13 because in that journal, I want you to comment on these readings that we have for the 2 weeks. I want you to comment on them together because they all relate to each other. We will have discussions during weeks 12 and 13, so there's a discussion assignment for this week and for next week. Again, that takes us to Thanksgiving week, which on my calendar I call week 14, even though there's no work assigned. So the Friday before Thanksgiving, which is November 18th, I will release all of the following week's requirements on Blackboard. So for week 15, the week after Thanksgiving, the whole discussion is a suggestions for course improvement. And I just want to give you a heads up on that. That is a graded discussion. I'm really just asking for participation, but I am asking for suggestions for course improvement. That does not, by the way, take the place of the course eval. There's an official course eval, which is optional, and you'll get notification of that directly from the university. This is the one that's kind of out in the open, suggestions for course improvement. The course evals themselves are anonymous, and I don't see course evals until long after the semester is over, several weeks after grades have been submitted. Your term project presentation. So I want to talk about that for a second. I made an announcement on Blackboard about that as well, and it's in the syllabus. But the term project presentation and the term project paper are both, they're two parts of the same ultimate project, but the presentation is a PowerPoint with narration. You don't have to use PowerPoint. You can use Prezi or other tools. But as long as everyone can view it in a presentable form and hear the narration, that's fine. That's going to be due December 4th. And as I said in the announcement, the way that's going to work is you post that on the discussion board, which I'll make available. That'll be technically the week 16 discussion board. And then I'll also have you post it on the assignments tab. Upload it there. So the other thing that we'll do during that week from December 4th through December 10th is review each other's presentations. I'll give you that week to review. Use the discussion board to comment back to each other on discussions. But then in addition to that, I will also provide each of you with evaluation sheets. I'm going to ask you to formally evaluate several peers, not everyone else, but each of you will evaluate probably maybe 3 or 4 peers formally on an evaluation sheet, which I will provide to you. That also forms part of the grade of the term project. And then the paper itself is due December 14th. And as I'm looking at this slide, what's not on here but was already due in week 11 on November 5th was your status update, and that was in the announcement that I posted on Blackboard. So that's what's coming up. this immediate week, uh, this week and the week before Thanksgiving, and then following that. So you can all spend your Thanksgiving week working on your projects. No, you don't have to do that. Just do enjoy Thanksgiving with your family. Okay, so let me get right into week 12 here. Where we are going, part 1. Okay, so I gave you 2 primary readings, and then I gave you a couple of ones that I tell you to scan. And I'll explain that in a second why I did that. So what was happening when all these things were written? Most of the readings that I've given you are situated somewhere between the late 1980s and the early 2000s. All right, so the 1990s were a turbulent period. Maybe they weren't seen as being as turbulent as some people see the 60s, for example, but they were turbulent. In context, the big deal that happened in the early 1990s was the Berlin Wall fell. So yes, Taylor Swift named an album 1989 because that's the year that she was born, but also the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. So I don't know which one was more momentous, Taylor Swift being born or the Berlin Wall falling, but that did happen in 1989, and that started a whole series of events, which of course included the demise of what was known as the USSR, the Soviet Union. And so in this period, this scholar named Francis Fukuyama, who actually worked for the State Department, wrote this article and then book, a couple of books actually, about what he called the end of history. And so what Fukuyama was talking about as the end of history was that this period represented the end of this Titan ideological struggle, between the forces of Western liberal democracy, the ideology of Western liberal democracy, and the totalitarian ideology, such as Soviet-style Marxism. And so he said that, yes, in fact, this is exactly like what Marx was talking about from a different standpoint, that history would end when the ideological struggle was done. So it's kind of an ironic title because he was saying that, yep, history ended, but guess what? The Western liberal ideology won and the Marxist ideology lost. Well, so just by the way, a lot of people, including this article in The Atlantic by Stanley and Lee in 2014, note that, of course, in the early 1990s, Fukuyama was wrong. Western ideology has certainly not yet won the ideological struggle. In addition to being a terrorist organization, ISIS and its twin Al-Qaeda are really ideologies. And there's another question as to whether, the kind of Marxism practiced in China, for example, and Russia, the old Soviet Union, has really died or has just morphed into something else. The other thing that was going on during this period, the 80s and 90s, was this continued mistrust of big government and the welfare state, especially in the United States, the UK, and elsewhere. This was when Ronald Reagan was president, Margaret Thatcher was prime minister of the UK. And so Reaganism and Thatcherism, as we might call them, really promoted the privatization of government. There was this notion that government was unable to solve all problems of society. And it is during this period that something we read about, new public management and reinventing government, kind of came to the fore. And so into this environment come these 2 readings that I'm asking you to look at this week from the early 1990s or late 1980s, called The Blacksburg Manifesto and the Rise of the Public Sector. So before you do that, I promised I'd get to this. I gave you actually about 4 readings for this week, week 12, and I have 2 that I kind of want to bookend the 2 primary readings with. First is this work by Salomon. He also wrote the rise of the nonprofit sector, but he also has this other work called The Tools of Government, written in 2002. And I only gave you an excerpt of that, specifically chapter 1, but I also gave you the table of contents. So this book is actually quite a useful book. So what I want you to do with this book is I want you to look at the table of contents, look at all those titles of the chapters in the table of contents, and that kind of gives you a good idea, a good outline really, of the various tools of government that Solomon is talking about. And then I want you to look at chapter 1, really just scan chapter 1. But what I really want you to look at are all the tables that Solomon has in chapter 1. So what he's doing with these tables is he's talking about the idea that government provides services through a variety of tools, not simply or even primarily through direct government, as you see in table 1.3, and that very often the choice of tools depends on the purpose of the service being delivered. So that's one part of the bookend. The other part of the bookend is this article by Bryson and Crosby et al. As a matter of fact, if you ever take a strategic planning class, you're probably going to run into John Bryson's textbook, because strategic planning is something that Bryson has been involved with for decades. But what he's talking about in this article is this idea of what he calls public value governance. And so what I really want you to pay attention to in this article, you can scan it again, but I really want you to pay close attention to table 1. Because what table 1 does is it presents a real nice summary by Bryson about what he says is a new model of PA. And he talks about NPM, as we've talked about, kind of as this transitory stage from traditional public administration to this new model, often called new public service. And that's something we're going to encounter in week 13. So look at those readings, as I said, as bookends around the 2 major readings that I'm assigning you to actually look at in depth. Okay, so public administration and the governance process. This is by Walmsley and a whole bunch of other people from Virginia Tech. And this article was initially written in around 1983. It's in this 1990 book, but it was initially written around 1983 and changed a couple times. And it was called the Blacksburg Manifesto. So a manifesto is a pretty strong term. Blacksburg happens to be where the Virginia Tech University is. And it's a fairly famous school of public administration. And it's called a manifesto for a reason. It's because they're very strident in their defense of the public administration. And you see I have that term in quotes, and that's exactly how they refer to it. In that title case, the public administration. They use that throughout the article. And so they say that, Wilson famously said that our problem is it's easier to write a constitution than to run a constitution. And they update Wilson a little bit because they say the problem is governing a modern republic with a commitment to freedom and justice on one hand and a commitment to a complex mixture of capitalism and state intervention on the other. So how do we do that? And they go on to say that what political leaders have done is that they have increasingly used the word bureaucracy as an epithet. Presidents of both parties have made attacks on it, that is, the public administration, as the centerpiece of their campaigns, then later only to find that this tactic, useful in getting elected, becomes a self-inflicted wound in the subsequent struggle to govern. So there is a gap between our need for effective governance and the capacity of our elected officials to provide it. And this widens. It widens actually through discourse. And so what Walmsley and his co-authors are talking about is that this thing called the public administration needs to be defended against these kinds of attacks if possible. And so they set out in this manifesto, if you will, to defend the public administration. So how do they make this case? First of all, they say that there are these pernicious mythologies that exist regarding public administration, and I think you've heard a lot of these, and we've all heard a lot of these. But they talk about this on page 33 of the article. They say that in fact, while there are some inefficiencies in government, there's also inefficiencies in the private sector. They talk about the fact that the federal government, in fact, has far fewer employees now than it did in the 1950s. They talk about the fact that most people who rely on government services really aren't dissatisfied with government service, but are satisfied. So they assert these things, and they are assertions. So you can argue on both sides of this. But what they're really saying is that as a major social asset, the public administration should be subjected, of course, to constructive criticism, but not diminished, denigrated, or decapitalized lightly for short-term partisan advantage. Then they go on to say that there is a distinctive character of public administration. That is to say, and they specifically say this, that public administration is not business. That business and public administration are actually alike in unimportant ways, but in very important ways, they're different. And so what they're calling for is adoption of what they call an agency perspective. And you can read about this agency perspective, but what they really mean is that within various agencies of government, there are these things, this specialized knowledge, this historical experience, time-tested wisdom, and degree of consensus regarding the public interest relevant to a particular social function. So I remember during the Republican debates, when there were still however many Republican candidates for president, there were 13 or 17, one candidate said his plan for, and it's not the one who got nominated, but this particular candidate said his plan for ISIS was that he would unleash the military. So, what he was really saying was that he was implying that for some reason elected officials, the president and Congress probably, had somehow constrained the military, and that if we only allowed the experts, the generals in the military, to be unleashed, they would defeat ISIS, in a matter of days or weeks or something like this. Well, I mean, you can argue about that, but what he seemed to be implying is that, at least in the Department of Defense, that this agency perspective actually is a good thing. I'm not sure that same candidate would apply that test to other agencies. And so we see this battle, and this is what Walmsley and his co-authors are talking about, where, sort of the public administration is kicked around and denigrated, and then sometimes it's lifted up as having specialized knowledge. But what they're arguing for is the fact that this agency perspective is actually not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Because if you take the members of these agencies as honest people, they are actually pursuing the public interest, and they understand that they're grounded in a constitutional governance process. And they also understand how this thing we've been talking about, called the politics administration dichotomy, works. And they talk about this in the article. They talk about 3 levels of the politics administration dichotomy. And you might want to look at that, because I think that's an interesting little 2 paragraphs in the article. And so they go on to talk about public administration and capitalism. They're asserting that our economy is actually a mixed economy, where both capitalism and public administration play a role. That there is no such thing as a pure administrative state or a pure laissez-faire capitalist state. This is their assertion. They talk about PA and the Constitution. And I mean, the first time I read this article, I was actually writing some things on John Rohr, and I believe this part of the article was written by John Rohr, who talks a lot about the Constitution. What they say is that the founders anticipated administration, though not in its, full capacity that it enjoys today. But that PA is actually this covenant with the Constitution. And they make this assertion that it is time for us to advance the proposition that the popular will does not reside solely in elected officials, but in a constitutional order that envisions a remarkable variety of legitimate titles to participate in governance. The public administration created by statutes based on this constitutional order holds one of these titles. So, as professionals, what they're ultimately arguing is that public administrators are trustees of this constitutional order. They're not the only trustees, but they are trustees of this constitutional order. So I think this is a really interesting defense of public administration. Again, there's a reason it's called a manifesto, and I think as you read it and you catch the tone of the article, you'll understand that. So that's one of the main articles I want you to read this week. The other one is this one written in 1994, called The Rise of the Nonprofit Sector. And so when you first read this article, you might think it's kind of quaint, right? It's also 20 plus years old. And he's talking about the rise of the nonprofit sector. But there's a couple of things I want you to talk about. He's talking about, Solomon talks here about a new focus on associations. You know, people are associating with each other more. Now this is interesting because this sort of directly contradicts what Putnam was talking about in Bowling Alone, which we just really touched on last week or a couple of weeks ago. But here's what Solomon's saying. He's actually mostly focusing on the international arena. What we know today as non-government organizations, NGOs. And so what he says is this. He says the upshot of trends, basically, is that there is a global third sector, a massive array of self-governing private organizations, not dedicated to distributing profits to shareholders or directors, but pursuing public purposes outside the formal apparatus of the state. The proliferation of these groups may be permanently altering the relationship between states and citizens, with an impact extending far beyond the material services they provide. Okay, so this is now 2016, and he wrote this article in 1994. But what he's talking about is really interesting, and it's good for us to think about, because, you know, we still talk about the public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit sector. But what he's saying, what Solomon is actually saying, is he's calling this a global third sector. And I think he does that intentionally. You know, we can't simply talk about business and government and then kind of dismiss nonprofit as, I think, frankly, the way a lot of people do, you know, as a bunch of people who want to do good and do nice things for other people. It's bigger than that. Notice the terms he uses. He talks about this global third sector pursuing public purposes outside the formal apparatus of the state, and that the proliferation of these groups might permanently alter the relationship between states and citizens. So it's not just, you know, people distributing bags of food. It's something that exists outside our understanding of what government does vis-a-vis citizens. So how did this happen, according to Solomon? And I'm really just kind of giving short treatment to Solomon, and I'd like you to get more into his article. He calls forth four things that happened, four crises that happened that gave rise to this global third sector. First, he identifies this perceived crisis of the welfare state. Well, we talked about this, right? He says, over the past decade or so, the system of government protection against old age and economic misfortune that had taken shape in the 1950s in the developed West no longer appeared to be working because social welfare spending was crowding out private investment. Okay, so actually this is just a demographic fact, and it's still true. that we have a large generation of people getting older in the Western countries and in some other countries such as Japan and China. So we have a whole generation of people that are really consuming a large part of our social welfare spending. So there was this crisis. The second crisis he points to is a crisis of development in developing countries. So what he says is the problems of development have grown so severe that today every fifth person on the globe lives in absolute poverty. Might actually be more than that today. So what he's talking about, a twin to the rise of the welfare state, was this rise in helping, if you will, post-colonial countries and allowing them to develop as capitalist countries. Well, what Salomon contends is that that development was stunted. And then he points to a global environmental crisis. He says the continuing poverty of developing countries has led the poor to degrade their immediate surroundings in order to survive, which is true. And this was written long before the Kyoto or Paris environmental treaties, or our very pronounced concern now with carbon emissions and with global climate change, where we see, I think, maturely, that the global environmental crisis has probably been contributed to by developing and developed countries. And then he identifies what he calls a crisis of socialism. Again, we talked about this as a contextual thing. Fukuyama talking about the end of history. And so Salomon says, while the promise of socialism had long been suspect, the replacement of laggard economic growth with actual regression in the mid-1970s helped destroy what limited legitimacy the communist system had retained. So, this idea that Soviet-style communism was going to rescue the working classes was kind of debunked. And so we have these four crises, and these four crises, according to Salomon, have led to this idea that this global third sector is going to start taking on some of the role of government. Okay, so where does that leave us? Let me go back to my bookends. One place it leaves us in the Bryson 2014 article is that governance is not done only by governments. There's a difference between governance and governments share some of the governance, but not all of it. So this is a good place to look at his article, where he's talking about this idea that the role of governments is to, along with other sectors, create public value. And I get this from the table. Governments act as a conveyor, a catalyst, a collaborator. They're sometimes steering, sometimes rowing, sometimes partnering, sometimes staying out of the way. A second idea, government does not deliver services through some big government takeover, but often does this by making use of existing capability within all other sectors. Even the Affordable Care Act, which is famously tossed around back and forth by people as a big government takeover of healthcare, in fact, what it actually purported to do, and whether it did this effectively or not is a very open question, but what it was supposed to be doing was allowing private insurance companies to insure the uninsured. I mean, that was the basic essence of what the Affordable Care Act was supposed to do with regard to healthcare insurance. And so it wasn't providing government insurance, it was actually facilitating the sales, if you will, of private health insurance. And so this is a good point to kind of glance at the Salomon article again about the tools of government. And he says a really interesting thing here. He says that these instruments, these tools, have altered public management in fundamental ways. But then he says, unfortunately, look at this last sentence. Unfortunately, however, neither the training of public managers nor the popular discourse about government operations has yet fully come to terms with the resulting transformation. So we still, in our public discourse, still talk about, government is the problem. Well, maybe government is the problem, but do we fully understand uh, how government actually does its work? That's what Salomon's asking us to look at. So, where this finally leaves us is this is to be continued next week with our last week of readings, where I'm going to ask you to read a couple articles by Denhart, and then a piece by Don Kettle that kind of talk about another vision of the future of public administration. So, as I said, the journal is in week 13, not week 12, and I want you to connect the readings for the 2 weeks. And so, for this week's discussion, because I think you guys are doing a great job in discussions, by the way, I just love watching you debate back and forth with each other. It's fantastic, really. I don't feel like I have to get involved that much because I think you guys do such a great job of tossing ideas back and forth to each other. So here's what I want you to think about. How do we, as public or nonprofit administrators, understand our role in a changing environment of public service where the walls between sectors have been permeated, yet where our public discourse continues to indicate that government is not to be trusted? So what is the role of the public administration in this environment? That's what I want you to think about for this week. And so again, weeks 12 and 13, the last weeks of reading, and then I think off to finalizing your project, which I'm also looking forward to. So thanks. I'm looking forward to the discussion this week. Thank you.